Archiving started.
Welcome to week 13's lecture. This week we'll cover chapter 11 in your textbook, which is State, Law, and Social Policy. The readings for this week are numbers 85, 86, 88, and 89, all out of chapter 11. So we're going to begin this week with just defining what the state is. Because when we hear the word state, we probably think of like the state of Kentucky or the state of Tennessee or the state of California. But what we mean here, okay, is something beyond that. We're not talking about the geographical definition of state, okay? And there's a definition in your book on page 548, which is the abstract concept. So it's not a tangible thing, okay? But it's a concept that is all forms of social organization, okay, that represent official power in society. So these are things like the government, law and policy, the court system, the criminal justice system, the military is included in this, and the police. All right, so when we use the term state, we mean all of these different things. Not just, sometimes even state, if we don't think of geographic state, we think of the government, and that's one part of the state, but it's only one part, okay? And what the state is responsible for, all right, like why we want to even talk about them, is it defines how people are selected to govern. So who gets to decide who gets to decide who's in power or how people get power and that sort of thing. It determines how others are governed, so the processes by which are used to govern others, okay? It maintains social order. All right, so punishment, keeping policy, and that sort of thing. It also determines how power is exercised, so meaning what it looks like when it's used, and how it is denied. So it denies power to people, and gives power to people, okay? And the decisions that are made up by what we would call the state, so the military, the government, the police, and that sort of thing, do have kind of a relationship to global, because even what we might think of as more local, state level, state controlled or state governed ideas can become international issues. You know, your book uses the example of, the United States is part of the UN, the United Nations, and so what our military does, what other militaries do, what our government does, what our police force does, what our laws say affect not only us, but people all across the world. And then by the same token, their laws and their governments and their militaries also affect us. So while we'll obviously mainly focus on the United States, these things do have a kind of global impact, and things that happen in other parts of the world affect us as well. And like a lot of things we've talked about this semester, the state kind of works both ways. It's what I would call a double-edged sword, because the state can maintain inequality, and we'll talk about how that can happen then as we go through this chapter, but it can also be responsible for breaking down inequality. Okay. And this here on the screen, if you're watching the screen, or if you're looking at the screen, should be inequality. It maintains inequality. But it can also resist or break down inequality through, obviously, laws and legislation. I mean, the Civil Rights Act, Title IX, which had to do with funding for education for male and female students, or to prohibit sex discrimination in athletics, but also beyond athletics. So, we've used the state to break down these barriers to make change, but at the same time, we've had to resist the state, to fight against the state in the sense that it can maintain a lot of these barriers that exist. So it works both ways. Like most of the things we have talked about this semester, it can empower and it can oppress at the same time. All right. Moving on to question number 2 on your study guide. Talking about how does the state function as a conduit for systems of inequality and privilege. What does conduit mean? Well, I mean, when you think of conduit, a conduit is kind of a channel, so to speak, for something else to pass through. It carries, or it passes. It's something that other things. It's a vehicle for other things. So, meaning that the state is a way that we can enforce some of these inequalities, or keep them going, or provide privilege for some and not for others. Okay, and the way that this works for the state level is that, you know, the government, the military, laws, criminal justice system, the courts, and that sort of thing, they regulate other institutions, okay, like the family, like education, like religion, and those sorts of things. They can set guidelines for behavior, okay, that we all follow, okay. It can channel, or are expected to follow. It can channel resources, you know, giving resources to certain groups or to certain people, and by that same token, power, all right. And there's a paragraph on page 549 that gives you examples of all of these things. So, you know, how does the state regulate family? Well, the Family Leave Act, which considers some families illegitimate and thus ineligible for state benefits. So, you know, we talk a lot about gay and lesbian couples or non-traditional families that are excluded from some state-run organizations or benefits of the state. Education, I already mentioned Title IX. Which has to do with sex discrimination in schools and in higher education as well. The state regulates the economy, you know, antitrust laws, okay, that prevent a company from becoming a monopoly. Anti-discrimination policies, okay, that government agencies and hiring agencies have to go by. Religion, you would think that there's not a whole lot here, but the very fact that there's separation of church and state is how the state affects or regulates religion. You know, taxing of religious organizations, or a tax exemption for religious organizations, and that sort of thing. So, you know, the state has its hands, so to speak, in a variety of other institutions. So all of these things are very interconnected. It's not like they're all separate entities. Just like we talked about intersections of identity, where you're a woman and you're black and you're a veteran and you're disabled and you're thin and you're educated, and, you know, all these different identities that mix together. Well, all these institutions mix together as well. But the state does have, what's slightly different about it is that it does have the power to regulate a bunch of other institutions. So in some way, I guess you could argue that it has even more power, and that's probably why we've seen it be used as a way to force change, really, on some of these other organizations. Like, for example, with the Title IX, which forced schools and higher education institutions to distribute funds equally between male and female, particularly sports is how we typically talk about it, but it's not just sports. Question number 3 on your study questions should be kind of a review. I mean, this is stuff we talked about very early in this semester, like the first chapter. You know, when did women receive suffrage? You know, that was in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Okay, something you should be familiar with at this point. So that is something that we've talked about before. But the other question I have here is, what was the status of women under the original U.S. Constitution when the United States was founded? You know, women did not have any legal being. They were not a legal person, so to speak. They couldn't own property. They couldn't purchase property. They couldn't make money, so on and so forth. So they were legal being only as attached to a male, so their father or their husband or an uncle or a grandfather, but some male figure gave them legal representation. They had no rights really except those when they were attached to a man. So, you know, we talked about some marriage laws, like in the last chapter, with marital rape laws, that they were essentially considered property, and transfer of ownership. When we talked about the family, the whole concept of when you get married, your father gives you away. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that much now, but it comes from a tradition of you're transferring ownership. She was owned a property essentially of her father. He was responsible for her, and now her husband is responsible for her. So it was literally kind of an exchange of property. So that was kind of their status. I mean, they were a part of society, but they really were confined. We have these differences of the public and private sphere, the public sphere being society and industry and government, and the private sphere being the home, and women were really confined to that private sphere. Okay, so that is an important, or that's the way things began. Okay, at least, and then we see there, and there's a little review there of the Seneca Falls Convention, some discussion of Susan B. Anthony, who was fined for trying to vote and that sort of thing. If we move on to question number 4, the Equal Rights Amendment. This was originally introduced in 1923, so a long time ago, all right? And it was supposed to, as your book calls it, deal with the inadequacies of the 14th Amendment. Because, see, the 14th Amendment was what we typically think of as giving citizenship to the slaves. But the way the 14th Amendment was written, which was that the state shall make or enforce any law, or should not make or enforce any law which will abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. But, as your book points out, this person that's referred to is assumed to be male, even if he's African American. So women were still denied. This was the justification for women still not having the right to vote. While African Americans have the right to vote, at least according to the Constitution, or to the the Bill of Rights, but women didn't, because they were not considered essentially people. I mean, citizens were considered male, and so they weren't citizens, so they couldn't vote. So the Equal Right Amendment, the 19th Amendment had already been passed at that point in 1923, but this was other rights, other citizenship rights. Legal status given to women. The Equal Rights Amendment was rewritten in 1940, okay? And the way it reads is, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, okay? So it specifies that you can't discriminate based on sex, okay? It passed Congress 50 years later, okay, in 1972, okay? But in 1982, it was defeated, okay? And the reason why it was defeated is for a constitutional amendment has to be passed by, has to be ratified by 38 states, okay, in order to pass, okay? It's not just a simple majority, okay? And this gets into the 3-state strategy that I asked about in question number 4. It lacked 3 states, so there were 35 states that had ratified, okay, that would have made the Equal Rights Amendment an amendment to the Constitution. Well, they needed 38. The 3-state strategy is basically the idea that because there was no specific time limit set on passing this amendment, that even now, currently, we're only 3 states away, that if 3 more states ratified this amendment, it would become an amendment to the Constitution, is the 3-state strategy, okay? Now, as your book points out, there are 19 states now that have some kind of equal rights amendment or legislation or guarantee in their constitutions, but we don't have any nationwide in our national Constitution. We don't have any kind of equal rights amendment, okay? And there's some discussion there about why this failed. I mean, it literally failed because it didn't get enough, support or wasn't ratified by enough states. But some of the argument is that it encouraged women to desert motherhood, so to kind of not be mothers, to let go of that, that it was anti-family, essentially, is the way your book describes it, and that this encouraged women to not be supported by their husband, as if, that a woman who wants that, who that's her choice, to be supported by her husband, that this Equal Rights Amendment would encourage her not to do that, that it would tell her not to do that. It was also, critics of it said that it would legislate abortion, that it would legislate gay and lesbian rights, okay, and that it would send women into combat. And we'll talk more about the military toward the end of this chapter, but that was some of the arguments against the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, the question that we kind of need to ask here is, do we still need it? Currently it's been, 30 years now, over 30 years, since this failed, okay, or it's been, since there's been any kind of strong push for it. So some people say that we don't need it anymore because we've had, rather than having a big constitutional amendment, we've had all these smaller, little by little, laws that protect against gender discrimination, okay? But the argument for this is that that's still not as strong as a federal law, okay? Because a federal law can be repealed, okay, by a simple majority, okay? But whereas for an amendment to the Constitution, you need 3/4 of the legislature, so 75% to repeal it, rather than just 51%. So the argument is that the rights that have been given, the laws that have been passed, could easily be repealed if there was an administration or a Congress that got control that, for whatever reason wanted to take away these rights, that they could, okay, without a whole lot of problem. But if we make it an amendment, that it wouldn't be as easy to do that, so that the amendment is still needed. So, it's still out there. There's still some support for this, but it has never officially, become an amendment to the Constitution. Your book just points out a couple, I didn't have a question for these, but a couple of things I just wanted to mention about the way women have been treated as citizens, and one has to do with when a U.S. citizen marries a non-U.S. citizen, and this was prior to the 20s, that if a woman married a non-U.S. citizen man, she lost her citizenship. She essentially was expected to go live wherever her husband was from. But if a man married a non-U.S. citizen woman, she automatically became a citizen. Okay, so obviously a double standard there. Okay, and it was in the 30s that this eventually passed to make this the same. No matter who married a non-citizen, that the laws would be the same. Jury duty. This was a shocking statistic to me that it wasn't until the 70s actually that a jury had to represent a community. So women were excluded from juries because they were wives and mothers, or they couldn't handle it, or whatever was the idea. And even though women paid the same taxes as men, okay, but they still were not allowed to be on juries. And even in the 70s, you would have African Americans facing an all-white jury, and so it was not until the 80s and then later in the 90s, like 1994, that a jury needed to be diverse, essentially, have women and men and people of different races and that sort of thing. And like I said, military service is another thing which we'll talk about more in detail, of how women have been excluded or left out of military service. Okay. Moving on, question number 5, I asked you about political office. Okay. Women tend to, in greater numbers, run for office at a local level. They're outnumbered at every level, but they are more common to run for office at the local level. Usually the reason, okay, for that is some of the stuff we've talked about before, and one is a conflict between their family and work role. And this goes back to the idea from a few chapters ago that women have more flexible boundaries, that it's almost expected that your home will invade your work and your work will invade your home, whereas men have more strict boundaries. And a good example of that, and regardless, this has nothing to do with political beliefs, but when I seem to remember, when Sarah Palin was the vice presidential candidate in the 2008 election, there was a lot of talk about, she has several children, and one of her children has some special needs. And there was a lot of discussion of how can she handle, being a mother and being a vice president. But, in the 2012 election, Mitt Romney has several children, Rick Santorum has several children in the primary here, and there's been little to no discussion of how will they balance being president with being a father. So we see that with women, there's this expectation that they're going to have to balance it, but there's almost an expectation that, men won't balance it at all. They'll just be president or be vice president, and that's it. The family won't interfere, so to speak. But with a woman, there's real conflict because she's still expected to be the homemaker and the caregiver, even if she is president or vice president of the United States or councilwoman or whatever. Another reason that often women don't run for higher political office is lack of financing, just having a harder time getting backing. It takes a lot of money to run for office. It's in the millions of dollars, even for some state level positions. It still costs in the millions of dollars to get elected these days. So lack of financing is one reason. And then there is still a lot of discrimination and sexist attitudes in politics, as I think we all know. So those are some barriers that a lot of women face, why either they can't or, why they have difficulty running for office or why they choose not to. It would be hard to throw yourself into that environment knowing what you're going to face. Okay. There are some statistics I want to share with you about the women and people of color in the 112th Congress, which is the 2011-2012 Congress. In the House of Representatives, there are 72 women, okay, in the House of Representatives, and that is 16.5% of the House, okay. In the Senate, there are 17 women, which is 17% of the Senate. So combined then, we have 89 women in Congress, which is the combined percentage there is 16.6% total. Okay, so a very small percentage. Now, of the women, okay, 29% are of color. So of those 89 women, 29% of them, all right, which is 26 women, are of color. They're not white. Women are more likely to vote for a Democratic candidate and to be affiliated with the Democratic Party. Some of the reasons for that are because the Democratic Party tends to emphasize issues like education, welfare, healthcare, and the environment. Okay, and so many women respond to those issues. Okay, and women as caregivers of children, as often teachers, as those who need healthcare access and who are responsible for caring for their families' access. A lot of single mothers who may need the assistance of social welfare programs, who are more concerned with toxins in the environment. You can see why that might match up. Whereas the Republican issues tend to be strong defense, so like military, anti-welfare, okay, which obviously would target a lot of single mothers, anti-affirmative action, which, as we talked, affirmative action is intended to increase the number of women considered for jobs and in the workplace. So, a lot of women are somewhat resistant to that of saying policies that we don't want you here. Okay. Now, as your book points out, this does in no way mean that everyone that all men are Republicans or all women are Democrats, or that all Republicans believe this or all Democrats believe this. These are just trends, okay? And speaking very broadly as trends, women tend to favor the Democratic Party more so than the Republican Party. And I believe in the last few elections that has held true, that the women voters have more strongly come out for Democratic candidates than for Republican candidates. And as a kind of alarming statistic, if you look at the chart in your book on page 555 and 556, this chart has different countries in the world and in their government, so whatever their government is, the percentage of women. And if you notice, the United States comes in at number 73, okay, with our this shows 16.8%, okay. I'm not sure what year this was based on, but 16.8%. And so we're fairly low, all right? But notice, some of the countries that we talk about, we discuss about how horribly women are treated, okay? Like, for example, Iraq, number 41. There's 25.2% of their government, seats in their government are held by women, okay? United Arab Emirates, 22.5%, okay? Cuba, right, up there toward the top, 43.2%, okay? Uganda, 31.5%. Afghanistan, number 34, 27.3%. So, again, obviously, in a lot of ways, women do have more rights in this country as compared to some of these other countries I've just named. But at least in our representation in government, it's still very, very much a boys' club. Barely 1 out of 6. Okay, in the government are women. So we are underrepresented, or women are underrepresented in that part of the state. Okay, in the government. I just wanted to review, this isn't one of your questions, but this idea, and I mentioned it with the citizenship under the Constitution, but this old doctrine that, you don't have to be necessarily familiar with the term, but the concept is what I'm interested in, and I do not speak French, so bear with me on my pronunciation. It's femme covert, or sometimes femme covert, and I'm not sure on the pronunciation there, but it's a policy essentially that the husband and wife are one person under the law. Okay, so a woman couldn't get a job without her husband's consent. She couldn't, if she made any money, she couldn't keep that money. She couldn't own property. She didn't have any control of the reproductive lives or how many children they had. And in the Married Women's Property Act of 1848, which was a very big deal, it allowed women to own her own property and to inherit property, which, if you were a daughter, you were the only daughter, your father didn't have any sons, and he wanted to give you property. That property then went to your husband, okay? And I don't know if any of you have heard of the show Downton Abbey. It's on PBS. It's a British television show, but it airs on PBS in this country, and it's set in the early 20th century. And the beginning of the show begins with this problem they're having because you have this couple, and when they married, she had a lot of money. Her father or her family had given her a lot of money that she inherited, but when she got married, all that money went to her husband. And then they only have daughters. And so it's becoming an issue of who's going to inherit land, who's going to inherit an estate, and all the money that goes with that. So, but as your book points out, even in this country, with the 1848 Property Act, there's still anything that the wife and husband own together, the husband controls. And this was until the 70s, actually. So that these laws were technically on the books. Okay, so something to be aware of. And we've talked in the last chapter about other kinds of protections, and that gets into your question number 7 on your study questions. You know, before the 1960s, violence in the family was not a crime. Okay, so, you know, you could beat your wife and it wasn't considered a crime. We've talked about marital rape before, that was until the 60s, that was considered a crime, or before the 60s that was not considered a crime. In the 1980s and 90s, we start to see laws regarding rape, so rape shield laws that protect victims of rape both from being named in the paper and from their sexual history being used against them. Okay. Mandatory arrest, we see in the 80s and 90s for domestic violence. If there's a domestic violence incident, that the abuser is automatically arrested, that you're notified of convicted sex offenders, you know, the sex offender registry that has become more and more well known in the last few years. We saw that legislation happen. Emergency protective orders being an option for women became in the 80s and 90s. You know, before the 1960s, contraception was illegal even for married couples. So that's a protection, okay, or a law that has been enacted, these legal trends that I'm asking about in question number 7. Obviously, Roe v. Wade in the 70s is a landmark court case for abortion legislation, which we talked about in a previous chapter. You see in limits on the hours that women can work, and equal pay laws, equal employment laws going on throughout the 60s. Notice a lot of these things are in the 60s. A lot of them overlapped with civil rights legislation. You know, it was one of those things that we tend to think of civil rights as African American, but it was really for a lot of people who had been marginalized and denied rights. So we see, you know, employment rights in the 60s. We see affirmative action policies begin in the 60s. So those kinds of gains. In the 80s, we see sexual harassment laws being passed and policies being passed, which protected women, especially in the workplace. In terms of divorce, it was in the 1970s that we get what's called the no-fault divorce, meaning that either party can file for divorce without the, you know, strict and often you had to sue for divorce, you know, prior to this. So you had to prove that certain things had happened. It was often an obstacle for many women financially, as well as other obstacles and that sort of thing. You have alimony procedures, which is kind of a complicated thing. On the one hand, alimony we don't see as much. It's been reduced, if not altogether eliminated, since the 70s. And on the one hand, that's more gender neutral by not saying, well, the woman needs to be paid because she can't survive on her own. So on the one hand, that's a good thing. On the other hand, as we talked about before, when a divorce happens, the woman typically suffers more financially because the man either tends to make more money if they both work, and then if she has not worked outside the home, then often the woman has no or has little to no financial resources. So, you know, it's one of those good news, bad news kind of things. It's a good thing that it's more equal, but it's a bad thing that it still tends to punish women. So sometimes even when we get equal rights, they end up working against us instead of working for us. Moving on, you know, just a point as we move into this next section in your book on public policy. Public policy, so, you know, laws and regulations and social regulations and that sort of thing, tend to reflect the interest of a dominant group. Like whoever is in power, the policies that exist tend to give them more power or help them keep power and maintain inequality, so keep other people from having power. And your book gives the example of like Jim Crow laws. These were not necessarily, because the 14th or the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, in theory, freed slaves, gave them citizenship rights, gave them voting rights and all of this. But then we still have these Jim Crow laws, which are more of just a social policy, and that these were in service of keeping white people, white men usually, in power and denying power and agency to African Americans. So, policies tend to reinforce what's already existing, okay, rather than working for those who are disadvantaged, okay. And the welfare policy is a good example of that. And on page 562 in your book, it gives you some figures on that. 14.3% of all families, which is about 43.6 million people, is who we say is living in poverty, which is defined as $21,954 for a family of four. Okay, and the poverty rate is growing. Okay, I think now it says that in 2011, at least 1 in 7 people in the United States lives below poverty. And this has risen at higher levels for African Americans and Latinos as compared to whites, although it has grown in every category. All right. And this is an example of how, those who already didn't have power, the policies that have been passed, and we'll talk some about social welfare programs here in a moment, how it tends to reinforce the problems that are already there. Okay. Now I asked you in question 8, okay, on your study questions about the bootstrap theory. So I want to go back to that, and that's something that we talked about in chapter 2, the bootstrap theory. But this comes down to the difference between who we blame essentially, as far as individual causes or structural causes for failure or success. So the theory is that hard work equals success. So if you work hard, you will be successful. So the idea there is that if you're not successful, you're not financially successful, or your family's not successful, whatever, that you didn't work hard. So you could pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you wanted to, is the theory there. And this is a dangerous idea. It creates a lot of stigma for people who do need government assistance in the form of welfare, which is the term we're using. So it tends to blame the victim. It's kind of like when we were talking about rape laws, it tends to blame the people who are using the government aid. So if they just worked harder, that they wouldn't need it, okay? And so that is how the bootstrap theory kind of fits into this topic that we're talking about. The Personal Responsibility Act, okay, and the Welfare Reform Bill are what I want to talk about next. So the Personal Responsibility Act and the Welfare Reform Bill, what these two things did, okay, the Personal Responsibility Act was in 1996. The Welfare Reform Bill was 2002. Okay, so there's some time in between these. But the Personal Responsibility Act, what it did was it terminated a major source of welfare, which had been the aid to families with dependent children, the AFDC, and replaced it with temporary assistance to needy families. Okay, and this put a time limit on the amount of time you could receive aid, which was 5 years. Okay, and it allowed states, like geographic states, to kind of set their own agenda for how funds were distributed, so who got what and how much. the welfare reform bill, part of what it did was raise the number of hours that a woman who was receiving welfare, or I guess a person, but it targeted or it primarily affected women, who was receiving welfare, how much time they had to spend working outside the home or in training, from 30 to 40 hours. Now, the problem with this, if we're talking about how these things tend to kind of keep inequalities going, is, if you're a woman who is who is a single parent, especially, and who is using temporary assistance to needy families, and let's say you have 2 or 3 small children at home who are not school age yet, okay, or at least a child or 2 who's not school age, and you're now required to spend more time outside of work or outside of home working or studying, which means you're away from home more, which means you're going to have to provide child care. So either find relatives who can watch your children, or pay for child care, which, as your book mentioned several times, most child care in most states is inadequate, and it's financially an obstacle for a lot of people. Child care is expensive, often costs more than what the people are making on welfare. Many people, not everyone, but many people who need help from government programs have high school education, so they're typically not making great amounts of money in whatever jobs they have. And so often those expenses aren't covered. And then, if you only have a 5-year limit, let's say you're trying to get a degree, say you're going to a community college, trying to get a degree. Well, if you can only take a couple of classes every semester for financial reasons or because of child care concerns or whatever, it may take you several years. And then after that, then you have to get a job, or you try to get a job, the economy's not great, you have a hard time getting a job. You could understand how you could very easily get to that 5-year mark and have legitimately been trying to improve your circumstances for all of those 5 years, but you're not out of the hole yet, okay? So what happens then, your assistance is cut off. Now you have no funds coming in outside of what you can get in a job, and how this might make the cycle of poverty even worse, okay? So those are some concerns, and how some of these public policies tend to punish those who they're intended to help, okay? But there is this other concept called welfare, which is, you have to say real carefully to hear it. And what this means, okay, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek phrase, which is sometimes called aid to dependent corporations. And basically what this is advantages, okay, or breaks, essentially, that are given to the wealthy or to corporations, if not wealthy individuals, okay? And there's 5 types of them. So these are things like grants, giving grants directly to these organizations or companies, allowing publicly funded research to be used free by a private company. So, let's say a university, which is publicly funded, finds, a medication that works for a particular disease. Well, then a private pharmaceutical company they didn't pay for any of the research for this drug, but then they can benefit from the research that was performed by a government-funded, publicly funded by tax dollars, research and development. Discounted fees on public resources, okay, tax breaks for the wealthy, which we've heard a lot about in the last few months, corporate tax reductions and loopholes, okay. And as it says in your book, it's been estimated that more than $200 billion in corporate welfare could be saved over the next 5 years if policies that were about these favors were reined in. But as your book points out, and as we can all see for ourselves, neither Republicans nor Democrats seem very anxious or eager to do anything about this, because much of their campaign financing and campaign funds come from these corporations. So, you don't bite the hand that feeds you, so to speak. So those are some issues related to public policy. Moving into number 9, what institutions within the state are responsible for enforcing law and keeping public order? So these are things like the court system, the criminal justice system. So the court system, the criminal justice system, either one, however you want to call that, the police and prisons, okay, are primarily responsible for enforcing the laws. So when it comes to women and crime, women are less likely to be arrested for crimes or to commit crime, or at least violent crime. 20% of arrests are of women. 23% of those on probation are women, okay? And 12% of parolees are women. So, they are a lower percentage there than what men. African American, in terms of in prisons, okay, is 45.5% of females in prison are African American. 33% of women in prison are white, and 16% of women in prison are Latina. Okay. This has actually grown over the last few years, and particularly in terms of drug-related crime. For property and drug crime, 30% property and drug crimes are primarily what women are sent to jail for. So usually non-violent offenses. Of violent offenses, 35% of violent offenders are women. So, 65% are male. So by far the majority of violent crimes are committed by men. Most, some of the other statistics there, 2/3 of women in jail are mothers. Either they have their children while in jail or they have children at home while they're in jail. Women are more likely to be first-time offenders, okay, rather than repeat offenders, okay. And homicide or assault cases are more likely to use knives, okay, rather than a gun. They're more likely to use kind of whatever's handy, so to speak. Just under half, so around 50%, okay, of women who are in prison have experienced abuse prior to their conviction, whether sexual or physical or emotional. And many women who commit homicide, it's in self-defense, but there are qualifications. There's 2 criteria for self-defense. One is that there has to be reasonable fear, is the way it's worded, reasonable fear or perception of danger, all right, meaning that, and sometimes it's even use the word immediate, that you're in immediate danger, okay, is one criteria. The other one is that the confrontation of the defendant, this is how it's worded in your book, with deadly force by the assailant or by an assailant, meaning that, again, they were under immediate kind of attack and danger of their life. And that's why sometimes it's difficult for women who, say, kill their husbands or an abusive boyfriend while he's sleeping, because courts and juries and lawyers will sometimes argue that, she wasn't in immediate danger at that point. He was asleep, okay? Now, obviously, we can take into account when there's been a pattern of abuse and the effects of that, and that complicates things. So it can be a very complex situation, obviously. But those are the 2 criteria, that you have to have reasonable fear or perception of danger, and that the defendant, so the person who's charged, was confronted by the assailant with deadly force. So with a weapon or was being physically abused, that sort of thing. All right, so the last topic that we want to cover is the military. Okay, and just first, let's talk a little bit about, the fact that the military is very male-dominated, not only in number, there are more men in the military, but also in just terms of ideology and attitude. And there's a passage on page 566 in your book But it says the second paragraph about the middle of it. The military is male-dominated, not only in terms of actual personnel, so the number, but in terms of the ways it is founded upon so-called masculine cultural traits like violence, aggression, hierarchy. There's a great deal of hierarchy in the military, and men tend to gravitate toward that more than women. Competition and conflict. Okay, the military has a history of misogynistic and homophobic attitudes that enforce highly masculine codes of behavior. Think back to when we were talking about gender, and I said that the way your book says and the way I said that gender is learned is that part of that process is through reward and sanction. So the military has a long history of sanctioning, negatively responding to anything that is not super masculine. So what it tends to do is weed out those who are not either super masculine or who are not willing to play the super masculine game, and it keeps away those who will not play by that game or play by those rules or who do not have those qualities. And so that's, it's not only just in number, but what's valued in the military tends to be very male-dominated as well. It was in 1976 that women were allowed entrance into academies, into military academies. Now, women have served in warfare and in the military for many years, but typically in fields such as nursing. Okay. But, after World War, or it was in World War II that you start to see women serving in any kind of actual military capacity, and that sort of thing. But still today, in the Army and military, women are not, are excluded from combat positions, but they do serve as pilots, as drivers, as interpreters, as medics, as checkpoint workers, and that sort of thing. So you do see more women in the military than you used to, but there are still some positions that they are left out of or excluded from. 15% of active duty military is women, and 20% of new recruits are women. Also, you see a growth in recruiting for African Americans. Okay. Men and women together, African Americans, make up about 14% of military personnel. But in the last few years with recruiting, you see that the majority of recruits, though, have been African American, and you see a growth in women there in recruits as well. In Iraq and Afghanistan, you see right now approximately 10% of the troops in Afghanistan or Iraq are women. Okay. You see a lot of, in the military, one of the issues in the military is women being very sexualized in the military. On page 567, it's pointed out that this is in the second paragraph, the end of the second paragraph. Misogynist military culture normalizes violence, pornography is often readily available, and prostitution is abundant around military bases. So this is kind of the environment that many women are in. So this might help explain why there's so few women, and also what the women who are there often face. And on the other hand, I mean, this is not to say that there's not a very much respect by a woman's male colleagues, so to speak, her fellow soldiers, when she serves. Now, that's not to say that every man in the military is misogynistic or doesn't want a woman to be there. It's just that there are these attitudes which are pretty common, even if they're not shared by everyone. Okay. Now, when it comes to sexual assault, in a 2004 study, they found that in 2003 there were more than 1,000 cases of sexual assault by women in the military, and by 2008, approximately that number had grown to 3,000. Okay, so it's pretty common. There's not always a lot of policies in place, a doctor even for a woman to see. Or there's a lot of cover-up. It's kind of that old boys club kind of thing. Boys will be boys kind of idea that we see working, unfortunately. And one point that your book made is that in VA hospitals, so for veterans, after they've served in the military, there's few gynecologists. So, you're a female veteran, you get the benefits of going to a VA hospital, but for your feminine, your reproductive health and your women's health issues, you may not have a doctor that can even treat you at a VA hospital. So again, there's an imbalance there. It's the assumption of, well, women aren't here, so we're not going to provide services for them. And of course, Don't Ask, Don't Tell has been repealed since the publication of your book. But just what I wanted to point out about that is that women were disproportionately affected by that. Most of the discharges under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or many of the discharges under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, were lesbians. Like 48%, okay, of those discharged were lesbians, and that's only 14% of the military's women. But half of the discharges were for lesbians, so they were kind of apparently particularly vulnerable or targeted for under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The last thing I want to say about, as we finish this chapter, is the very last paragraph on page 569. The state is a very powerful institution that has enormous effects upon women's everyday lives. It's important to understand how gender, race, and class mold and shape government, law, and policy, and how these institutions reflect and promote the needs of some groups over those of others. Okay, so it kind of, I think, very nicely sums up the overall message of this chapter of how powerful this is as an institution and how it really does affect every part of not only women's lives, but all of our lives. And reading number 85, that is the text by Susan B. Anthony from 1898, kind of her argument for women's vote and women's rights. Okay, so to take a look at that, reading number 86 has to do with, poverty and social welfare, particularly as it targets, single women and that sort of thing. So an essay worth looking at there. Reading number 88 is Delinquent Girl. So this talks about juvenile offenders and then women in prisons and rehabilitation and that sort of thing. And then reading number 89 is about female soldiers. So, what they go through and what they experience in the military and in combat and that sort of thing. And as always, the other readings in this chapter are obviously relevant to what we're talking about. They're not required for you to read. I won't be asking you questions about them on the final, but they are, I think, worth looking at. They may be useful to you as you're preparing your final paper and that sort of thing, depending on your topic. So in here, your discussion board and reflection journal for this week. So for the discussion board, how did those early American assumptions around the founding of our country that citizens were white men perpetuate contemporary social inequity? So what I'm essentially asking is, how can we still see the effects of those? If it started with this idea that women are property, that men are the ones who make the decisions and who own things and who really drive the world, how do we still see some of those effects today? And then what myths about gender and race do you think are driving the discrimination in the military and the welfare system and criminal justice? Try to give some examples of those myths. What do we believe? And then how do you see that playing out in the military or in welfare or in our court system? Okay. For your reflection journal, I'd like to see you talk about how well you think your local police force or how you think your local agencies handle women's issues, especially rape and domestic violence. Do you think that they've had sufficient training to be supportive? What do you think makes it difficult for them to be effective at dealing with those particular kinds of crimes? And then think about experiences of female soldiers or you've heard of that on leaving or returning from, Afghanistan or Iraq, or, what can we learn about military culture from listening to their stories? As you're working this week, as always, if you have questions, post on the discussion board or email me. And this concludes week 13's lecture. One more week to go.